Iraq, Mark, and me, we all went to graduate school in Syracuse. Then, after getting his MA, Jeff went to University of California in Irvine, and he finished his PhD there. And then, I think right now he's coming from Harvard, and he worked mostly on early modern philosophy, Hume, Leibniz, Berkeley, and he has many publications from different journals. And I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. So, Sue and I were actually housemates for a time in Syracuse, so it's nice to see you. Nice to see you, everybody. So I want to thank Steve and Chrissy for setting this up. This has been really absolutely lovely and a nice opportunity for all of us. I'm going to propose a slightly different format. But we had a lot of license, and Steve asked me to sort of talk about medieval philosophy, maybe more on the sort of Western/Christian side. That's what I'll do. Format will be a little bit different than we've had so far. People are probably starting to flag a little bit at this time of the day. I'm going to invite questions and comments and discussions as we go along. And I'll keep things moving along, so it might be the case that we'll have a bunch of questions at some point, and I'll sort of keep us on track so that we get through this sort of strategy in spite of taking questions. But rather than taking up all the hands, let's do it as we go along. Okay. So as far as I know, and I'm happy to be informed, this is the right place to have it. As far as I know, broad brush definition of occasionalism would see it be popular or engaged with in the Islamic medieval tradition. And then in the Western medieval tradition, it's not very popular. It's recognized as a possible position, but generally rejected. There's a few possible exceptions. And then it's picked back up again with Cartesians that Brandon is going to talk about later on, and then it's got its own history. They got Malebranche being a high watermark among those Cartesians. I'm happy to have that broad brush story corrected if anybody's got thoughts on that. If that's right, it raises an interesting question. It raises the question, well, why doesn't occasionalism find much support among the Christian, Western, medieval philosophers? I don't have a research answer to that question. I suspect one large piece of the answer to that question has got to be that in the West they found a different view. They got a view that they saw as acceptable and attractive and reasonable, that they thought sort of won out over occasionalism. It wasn't the case that they didn't recognize occasionalism, but they thought they had a better confluence of ideas that they found more attractive. And those really connect up with the issue of divine causation and the relationship between divine causation and creaturely causation. I think there's a lot of people are weighing different ways, and we get some sort of consensus, I think, in the West that is anti-occasional. So today I wanted to focus on divine efficient causation and three doctrines in there: creation, conservation, and concurrence. That's the sort of mix that they take as a replacement or alternative to occasionalism. And then, okay, well, so medieval period is spoil of riches. There's too much to do there. So I thought I would focus on the treatment at the hands of Francisco Suarez, in part because he's very systematic, he's very good, he comes at the end of the tradition. So there's a sense in which you can see him as trying to pull together the threads of his predecessors, and he's very late in the period, and this is sort of a statement of what Christian medieval Western views on these topics might be. So that's the plan. We'll essentially be going in take the topics in order, starting with creation, then going on to conservation, and then taking up concurrence, in that way. But then I thought maybe one other thing I would do is before we get there, maybe I just say a few words about Suarez himself, since we're sort of a diverse group and Suarez is not the biggest. So a few words about Suarez. Suarez is born in Granada in the south of Spain, not so far from Gibraltar, in the year 1548. He famously, this is good news for me, he famously gets off to a slow start. He applies to the Jesuits, and he's one of 50 applicants to get rejected. But nonetheless, he finally, he petitions and petitions, and finally he gets in, sort of on a probationary status. But he becomes one of their most renowned figures. His immense talents are eventually noticed. He rises to great prominence in his own lifetime, both professionally and academically. He taught for almost 20 years at Coimbra. Coimbra is the picture in the background here. His works are widely distributed in his own lifetime, especially through Jesuit channels. Jesuits, so it's getting distributed through those channels in particular. He dies on September 25th in 1617. His philosophical masterpiece, from which I'll be drawing today, is an English metaphysical disputation. It consists of 54 disputations, nice big, now published 2 big volume set. 54 disputations covering an incredibly wide range of philosophical topics. Those 54 disputations are systematically arranged in 7 unequal sections. I will read these for you. His treatment of causation in particular falls under the causes of being. That section itself is divided into 7 subsections. Here they are. Suarez's treatment of divine efficient causality falls under, falls under the causes of being. That's divided, 7 sections. That discussion of divine causality is found in disputations 20 through 22, and they're arranged this way: creation, the first action of the first cause; conservation, the second action of the first cause; and concurrence, the third action. Okay. And for those interested, probably not so much for this group, we are lucky to have a lovely English translation of those sections of the disputations in this nice volume by Cardoso, by Alfred Cardoso. It's got a nice introduction as well that I'm indebted to. I think most people working on this topic are indebted to. It's really a great piece of scholarship. I don't agree with all of it, but nonetheless indebted to it. Okay. So with that minimal background in place, let's turn to the philosophy. So like most philosophers working in the medieval Christian tradition, Suarez maintains that God creates ex nihilo. So what does that mean? Creation ex nihilo involves an agent-making entity. This is Suarez, quote, without acting on any subject or patient, and thus without actualizing any antecedent passive potentiality had by any subject. So, unquote. So every aspect of the entity is created literally from nothing. There's no matter or matter or receptacle or something like that gets acted on. There's just nothing. Creation in that sense positively precludes the existence of some already existing subject, or realizing some already existing potentiality. Suarez maintains that we can prove, 1, that creation is possible, 2, that creation actually exists, and 3, that in the universe there exists a single necessary first cause. Like all things you'd expect. He's a bit cagier, interestingly, he's a bit cagier about whether we can prove that God alone is able to create ex nihilo. He effectively argues that it can't quite be established by reason, but that it can be shown to be very likely, and that we should accept that God alone is able to create ex nihilo as a matter of faith. In doing so, he's effectively trying to steer middle ground between some Neoplatonist views, some of which or what I think of as Neoplatonist views, some of which we've heard recently, where there's intermediary creators, and I think Thomas's view, where he thinks it's really only possible for God to create ex nihilo. Nothing else could possibly do that. Suarez thinks Thomas is sort of the way he ought to go, but he thinks you can't quite prove that, because why couldn't you create something that could have a limited creation? Maybe God's the only thing that could create anything, but maybe God could create something that could then create something itself that's less than than full-blown everything that exists. Okay. Creation ex nihilo should be distinguished from what we might call production within the order of nature. So a leaf turning from green to red, a pair of rabbits conceiving a bunny, or an artist forming a statue. Those are all things I'm going to call production rather than creation. You might have thought, oh, the artist creates a vase. Just for terminological clarity, I'm going to call one thing creation, one thing production. The production of ordinary effects within the order of nature generally involves acting upon an already existing subject or realizing some already potentiality. So the artist doesn't create ex nihilo, the artist shapes a bunch of clay into a vase. Suarez takes production to be appropriate to both God and creatures. Again, something of interesting, something of intermediary view. A naturalist might deny that God is involved in production. You leave God out of it, or a mere conservationist might deny that God's involved in production, that is, in something like the shaping of a vase. Whereas an occasionalist might deny, or occasionalist, as I understand occasionalism, would deny that creatures are involved in production. So Suarez thinks that God can be involved in production and creatures can be involved in production, contrary to two more radical views. Significantly for Suarez,
concretism, right?
well, so concurrentism is going to be a particular view that we'll get to about the understanding of how God and creatures can act together in bringing something about.
It's the umbrella, one of the subsections.
Yeah. So I think this first view opens up the door for concurrentism as a possible position, but doesn't preclude other positions. And partly what I want here is just the contrast. And so I wanted to set these two kinds of orders up, which I think sometimes get confused. And to some extent, the occasionalists think they ought to be collapsed because the occasionalist is going to deny one of those orders as a distinct order from creation. But we'll come back. So significantly for Suarez, as for most scholastics, God's act of creation was not viewed as a rival to creaturely production within the order of nature, but rather something more like a necessary condition for it. God's act of creation was held to bring into being the active and passive powers of creatures, which then unfold within the order of nature, producing effects within the natural world. One of the many interesting questions Suarez takes up in section 20 is whether, quote, some entity could have been created from eternity. He argues that nothing precludes such a case, insisting that, quote, actual newness of being that is not being affected from eternity does not belong to the nature of creation. Why is that interesting? It's interesting. I think it's interesting. It's interesting for us because it might seem to undermine Suarez's claim, which again we'll come back to later, that there's only a rational distinction between creation and conservation. A natural way to understand that suggestion is to think that creation connotes the beginning of being, and conservation the preservation of being. Right? So Suarez, I guess backing up a step, Suarez thinks there's a rational distinction between creation and conservation. That's going to be important for later discussions, I'm sure, because we'll talk about creation, conservation as a continuous creation or as a continuous recreation. So Suarez is going to say there's just a rational distinction between those two. And now I've brought up this little interesting wrinkle because he says something could be created from eternity. And you might think, well, this is going to be confusing because what is the basis for the rational distinction if it isn't the idea that creation connotes the beginning of being and conservation connotes the continuation of being? Right? So he said, so what to do about this? So to his credit, Suarez notices the word. Here's Suarez. Oh, I went back for. Oh, I hit the wrong button. All right. This slide. Okay. it belongs to the nature of creation that be distinct from conservation, at least conceptually and denominatively. But creation is distinct from conservation only by virtue of the fact that creation bespeaks the newness of being, that conservation does not bespeak. After all, the reason why an angel who is now being conserved by God through the same action through which he was created is not being created is that he does not now, in the present, have a newness of being. So I think on first pass this looks like a good argument. On first pass, creation and conservation seem to differ only from one another, only in that creation connotes the beginning of a continuous act, while conservation connotes the continuation of a continuous act. If the act of creation is eternal, if it has no beginning, then the distinction threatens to collapse. Suarez, however, offers a reply. This is in section 20. Here it is. Even in the case of an eternal creation, it is possible to draw a conceptual distinction between creation and conservation. For insofar as this creation is said to exist absolutely in eternity itself, as a simple participation in created esse, it has the nature of creation. Whereas insofar as we envision within it a certain imaginary succession, it has the nature of conservation, for any designated instant of that succession. Anybody have thoughts on this? Yeah.
Just to say, I don't understand why there can be called creation.
The eternity bit. So if you've got an eternal being, why would it be called creation?
The point would be newness of being. But what's new? I really don't think that's.
Okay. All right. So I'll roll out a little bit and then see if I'll check that. All right. So I think the key to understanding Suarez's reply is to recognize that eternity for Suarez is not to be thought of as an infinitely long succession. Early modernists might see anticipation here of distinction often attributed to Spinoza between sempiternity, that is existing infinitely within time and eternity existing outside or abstraction from time. So one thing you might think of for eternal existence, you might think that goes on forever. Another view is that you might think, no, it's something that you either doesn't exist in time or viewed under the guise of eternity is abstracted from time altogether.
This was, by the way, spelled by St. Augustine.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
St. Augustine. This concept.
Yeah, Augustine being almost everybody to these discussions of time.
Yeah, well, rational distinction. It's not just if there's a rational distinction, is there any distinction in being, or is it just a distinction about knowing two kinds of being which are the same thing?
I think it's just a distinction in how you think about the two.
Okay, so there's no sort of formal distinction or anything.
No sort of formal distinction, certainly no formal distinction, and no real distinction.
So I follow up.
Yeah,
Is this to say creation and conservation? Conservation are the same divine activity.
So I'm my own view. Yes, my own view on what's going on in Suarez is he thinks there's one act, and then creation is just a connotation that says it's the beginning. You're thinking about the beginning of the act, whereas conservation is you're thinking about not the beginning of the act. But there's sort of one thing going on there. And this will be relevant because later on, especially in Boğaziçi, I'm sure other people as well, you get some sort of thinking that maybe there's something more than a rational distinction. That's going to drive a lot of arguments for occasionalism that Suarez isn't really engaged with because he doesn't see that as a problem coming down the track. Yeah.
Still clarify this. So to have a beginning means for Suarez that this creation is said to exist absolutely in eternity itself as a simple participation in created essence. Just not the idea, because that doesn't seem like having a beginning. So
I'm saying
if having a beginning, if creation is about having a beginning, and beginning is spelled out as for insofar as creation is said to exist absolutely in eternity itself, as a simple participation in created essence. I mean, what, I suppose I'm just.
No, okay, good. Okay, good. So we've got this distinction between existing in time forever and existing in abstraction in time. So what I think with that background, with that in mind, I think you think Suarez's core thought is that conservation connotes a successively continuous creation, while creation is not. For a creature to exist successively, it is properly said to be created only in the first instance, and then conserved in its successive instances, even if those successive instances go on forever. So that's sort of the normal case we think of. So a creature, when we think of a creature existing in time, then it's properly said to be created only in that first instant. And then after that, it's said to be conserved. For a creature that does not exist successively, that is for an eternal creature, that is one abstracted from time, if you like, it's properly said to be created eternally, and never properly said to be conserved, since it doesn't have any successive instance. We might put the point this way. Conservation always connotes the successive continuation of created being, and is therefore distinguished from creation, which does not connote a successive continuation of created being. So there's two cases. There's the created being, there's the temporal being and the atemporal being. In the temporal being, conservation always connotes successive existence. And so only the first instant is in conservation, that's creation. In the atemporal being, the terms still are rational, there's no rational distinction between them. But there is no successive existence. So there is no conservation. And there is no prior existence. So there's only creation. So Suarez thinks, even in spite of the fact that there's a rational distinction between conservation and between creation and conservation, he thinks it's still possible for a being to be created eternally without his rational distinction collapsing.
So, as far as I understand,
Yeah.
he understands eternal creation as a single whole. And this is why there is no cessation, and it is not conservation.
Well, so he thinks for a temporal being, there's both creation and conservation. So there's one act. It's if you're thinking in terms of time, then it's a temporally extended act. And so, what's that?
Just one.
Just one
Single
act.
whole.
One single whole, that's right. And two different terms that connote two different features of that single act. And the first bit I created, not too bad. Too bad we have time. Then I just introduced this puzzle because you might think, okay, if there's this rational distinction, then how can there be an eternal creation? And then to solve that, I introduced this distinction, how you might think about eternality. And then you can see that for Suarez, this all sort of does make sense. Because in the eternal being, he thinks there is no conservation. There's just creation. Because conservation applies to successive instances. So he can sort of have it. I'm suggesting, this is all interpretation, I'm suggesting he can actually sort of keep all these balls in the air. My last question, then we'll move on to conservation.
So eternal creation, how would that differ from dependence?
Well, he's happy with dependence. So conservation is, well, we'll get to conservation next, but conservation is a form of dependence. And so he thinks even an eternal being, so he thinks there's going to be eternal creatures, and they'll also be dependent. They won't be dependent temporarily, because they're eternal. That is, they're abstracted from time. But they'll still be dependent in the mode of creation.
Is this a minus position? Very technical you can creation from one eternity, which means ontological independence, not being posterior in time. Would you say it's the same as a minus position?
I will give you the smart answer, which is I would say I have to go back and look at it once.
Because it seemed to be very similar.
Yeah, I'm less sure about what his views on eternality are. good. It's a good question. All right. So I'm going to push on then to our next doctrine, conservation. So, like most Christian medievalists, Suarez maintains that the world depends on God's causal activity not only for its initial creation, but also for its continued existence. To invoke a frequently used analogy, they held that just as the rays of the sun would cease to exist immediately upon its extinction, likewise creatures would immediately fall out of existence without God's continual support. Naturally, a wide variety of arguments were marshaled in defense of this traditional view. Suarez offers the following argument, which he attributes to Aquinas. Alright, so here's an argument for conservation. We see that light depends on the sun for both its being made and its being conserved. Because the sun is a cause of a higher nature, and by a certain participation, it is a cause of the light, not only with respect to its being made, but also with respect to its essence. But each created being depends on God more essentially than light depends on the sun. And each created being has a lesser participation by far in the divine essay than light has in the sun's brightness. Therefore, it depends much more on God for its being conserved. I will pause to invite thoughts on this before I push on.
Yes. In physics, if you look at it, I will talk about it in the last session. Recreation implies conservation. Recreation implies conservation. It's a bit complicated idea how to reach from recreation to conservation, but it is mathematically and physically verified by the so-called Noether theorem. Conservation is related to recreation.
And from more historical perspective, it's another question, maybe more question from a historical perspective, whether conservation implies recreation. That's whether the converse is also true.
I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's fine.
Yeah.
I will show you. Sorry.
Would be great. Brandon?
Yeah, can you help me out with one thing? Because I stumbled here in the middle. But each created being depends on God more essentially than light depends on the sun. Fine. And each created being has a lesser participation by far in the divine essay than light has in the sun's brightness. Therefore, it depends much more on God for its being conserved. I don't understand if that's a two-premise argument with a conclusion. I don't understand that second clause. Each created being has a lesser participation by far in the divine essence than light has in the sun's brightness.
Okay, good.
I would have thought it was exact opposite. Then the conclusion would follow, obviously.
Right. I think the thought is that I see what you mean. So there's a weird way where it feels like it's like inverted.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of the more tenuous the whole, the more it depends on.
Okay.
I think that's the thought. I see why you're thinking it, but could it be another way? The more intimately related it is.
Yeah.
I mean,
There's kind of a platonic notion there of participating in the homosome.
yeah. But it's like hanging by a thread.
Yeah.
And so it's really dependent on it.
Yeah.
Although, the sense in which it could be more dependent than the rays of light on the sun is a little foreign to us.
Yes, it
It can be resolved by knowing that perhaps he thought that once light leaves the sun.
Yeah, he doesn't. I know what the contemporary physics, he doesn't have that view. This is over and over and over again, this example is used, and over again. I mean, they always assume that, it's not like a wave, it's not like, it really would be at the instant to summon out, the light would also out, which we don't do. Yes, please.
It would be that the relation between the sun and the light is more internal, like the relation between God and creatures. So the less it participates in that, the more different it is, the more creaturely it is. So it needs to be kind even more. That's how
Yeah, I think Brandon's thought is, what about last bit? Why is it, the less internally rated is, why is it more dependent rather than less dependent?
Because it is less being. So in order to really
Yeah, I think that's the right answer. I think that's the right answer. While conceding to Brandon, I see why you might think of it the opposite way or something like that. Doug, did you want to?
It makes sense to me just thinking that once you add up all of the light, that is the sun's brightness. There's nothing more to the sun's brightness. But with all of us human beings, if you take all of our nature, there's just add that all up, you don't get God. There's a whole lot more to be
Yeah,
God
right.
than just we material beings.
Right.
That's how I understand.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. All right. So I think the argument, as Suarez acknowledged, is a posteriori. We learn all this from experience, I guess. It's not obvious, I think. And it's based on analogy. The relationship between light and the sun is only analogous to the relationship between created being and uncreated being. Nonetheless, Suarez calls the argument, quote, utterly evident to a well-disposed intellect. Stepping back from specific arguments, perhaps the deepest well of support for the doctrine of conservation, I think, is to be found in the intuition that any entity which depends on God by its very nature, or its coming into being, that is, being created, must also thereby depend on God by its very nature, or its staying in existence. So here's Suarez. The very same deficiency that is found in a creature's essay at the first moment at which it comes to be, namely its inability to exist without the action of another, is found in the creature for as long as it endures an essay. Since it is precisely because of its own essay, and precisely insofar as it is a creature, that it needs God's influence in order to exist, it needs that same influence for as long as it exists. I think this is sort of the deepest, the deepest reason why people believe in conservation. They think, in this period, they think, by the nature of a created being is such that it can't bring itself into existence. It's got to be brought into existence by something else. But if that's the kind of thing you are, then you also can't keep yourself in existence. You're going to pop out of existence without that same divine support.
Actually, what is the thing in the essay that requires dependence?
Well, I'm sure it's metaphorical, but it's the kind of essay.
What, in
Right.
that sense, what is the point of dependence here? What kind of essence depends on something else?
So playing, I'm going to actually go. So playing Suarez created essay.
But this is why, what we try to explain. Why do we call it creative essay? There must be something explaining why it's creative. Right? What kind of particular essence makes the creative essence?
But I think it's important for him. I think it's important for him that it's not any kind of essence, right? It's the kind of being.
Okay.
Because that kind of being can be instantiated in many different kinds of essences. So there's the big distinction that I think he's got in mind here is uncreated being and created being. And if it were anything that's uncreated being is by argument going to be God. You could then argue for uniqueness, right? But now we're saying there's something other than God. That's going to be created being. And that's what creation gets you. Creation gets you from uncreated being to created being. And we get all sorts of arguments for why there's got to be uncreated being, there's going to be created being. And we get some arguments for why there's created being and how we can know there's created being. So now we've got these two different kinds of being. And now the second thought is, so give me doctrine of creation. Now I want next, Suarez, I guess, want conservation. Well, why conservation? And I think the deep thought, the central thought is, well, if you've got created being, if it's the sort of stuff that has to be created, then it's also the sort of stuff that has to be conserved.
I think there is parallel with this approach with Dr. Shihad's presentation of the Sina, when he talked about the issue about essence in terms of contingency, because if we see identify the dimension of contingency in a particular essence for dependence on a cause. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's sorry.
Yeah, let's, go ahead, no, I'll come back.
It sounds very Avicenna, and Avicenna would say exactly the same here, except to probably we would add that it's because the essence is, everything that has an essence is possible of existence, that it needs a cause, continuous cause. But, I mean, I'm wondering whether there is an Avicenna influence on this.
Yeah, or whether it's common influence, or certainly there's a common influence, and then whether it's direct or not is a good question.
I think Suarez is very knowledgeable of Islamic philosophers. He cites them by name in his books.
Yeah.
Probably he is aware of this.
But yeah, you think he's certainly aware of how much Avicenna is getting versus like Averroes.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in Spain, so I mean,
Yeah.
So,
but you know, then there's influence of Avicenna on Averroes as well. So, but he is more Aristotelian than sort of Neoplatonic. But I'm sure there's influence. It's just a question of how direct or in how specific.
But the link made between possibility, essence, and causedness, I think that comes from Avicenna. I'm not sure. Not aware of pre-Avicenna sources that make this
Yeah.
link.
So more research for you. Yeah, please.
But this argument won't apply really to eternal creatures. I was wondering, so coming back to what you were talking about in the last section, it seems to me that if God, I mean, I'm wondering, do you think this is supposed to apply to eternal beings, where their eternalness is part of their essence? So if God can create a being that is eternal, and being eternal is part of its essence, then wouldn't this get counterexample to this general claim about created beings?
He thinks explicitly that it's going to apply to eternal beings. So he thinks eternal beings need to be conserved as well. That is not God, but any creature. And this argument is supposed to catch those out, right? Because if it's a created being, and he's argued that there can be eternal created beings in there. So he thinks even if it's an eternal being, then it's going to need to be conserved because it's got the same kind of being that's dependent by its nature. So I think I'm going to skip a section for the sake of time, but he's going to go on to draw a distinction. He thinks things that he's got two kinds of things. He's got eternal creatures and non-eternal creatures, and he thinks non-eternal creatures need to be conserved in two senses. They need that original being that they get instilled in them. They need that to be preserved. He thinks eternal creatures are the same way. They need that original being in there to be conserved. And so both eternal and non-eternal beings are dependent upon uncreated beings. Now, I used a little temporal talk in the eternal one, but just by sloppiness, right? What he thinks non-eternal creatures need a further kind of conservation. He thinks you need to essentially protect them from being destroyed within the order of nature. Right? So you need to shelter them, and you need to keep them from getting killed, and you need to keep them from...
Wouldn't then all eternal beings only, apart from God, only be contingently eternal?
I think all creatures are contingent. Whether they're creatures... how to apply that operator is a little tricky, but that, yeah, only God's going to be the necessary being. So even eternal beings, if they're creatures, are going to be contingent.
But they're going to be contingently eternal. They're not going to be essentially eternal.
Why not essentially eternal?
Because if they're essentially eternal, it will be part of their essence to continue in existence.
They don't have to be necessary to be eternal. Yeah. So that
They could be essentially eternal. That is, if you're going to create an eternal being, you've got to create it eternal. You've got to make it that, it's that kind of being. You could say that without saying that the eternal being is itself necessary. So I suspect that's his view. That is, an eternal being is the sort of thing that it couldn't exist for a day. But it might not be created at all. Steve,
I think this argument really needs all kinds of support. A lot of things you don't do, you have the ability to do. What we know is we didn't exist without the action of another, but it doesn't follow from that we are unable to. And it doesn't follow that either that if we're unable, it's because of our essence that we're unable. Those are two very big steps. And if you look at my essence, I can say all you see is rational and animal, and there's nothing there that, it seems like rationality and animality could have been there forever.
Continue on that.
yeah, please.
I mean, I'm really supporting what Nazi was saying a little while ago.
Well, the inability to exist without the action of another. I'm not sure if I see how it is that we find that property in a created thing. I mean, we do find the property of someone being able to create a property, but as you can be created and capable of existing on their own, right? It doesn't. I mean, what is the argument to show that it's not possible? And it's obviously referring. What's the point about the first moment at which it comes to be? I mean, okay, it has to be the first moment that it's created. The first moment I'm created shows that someone created it. But why does it show that I'm incapable of sustaining existence?
I think what he's thinking is it's really your inability to exist without being created. That's the telltale sign that you're not going to be able to continue to exist without being conserved. I'm sorry, I'm just keeping track of time a little bit, so we get to everything. Maybe I'll push on a little bit, because I'm going to say, I confess, this doesn't actually strike me as all that convincing. We might think of it as turning on the question of what we might think is ontological inertia, right? We might suppose that things that come into exist tend by their own nature to go out of existence. This might be analogous to thinking that objects put in motion tend to come to rest if left to their own devices. But we might also think that things that are brought into existence tend to stay in existence unless existence is undermined from the outside. This would be analogous to supposing that things put into motion tend to stay in motion unless something else intervenes. As far as I can tell, there's no a priori reason to prefer one view rather than the other. And if that's right, what I've suggested with central intuition is inconclusive. You could think beings like, is non-inertial, in which case you'll think you're going to need conservation if you're going to stay in being. But you might think that it is inertial, in which case you might think, no, something can be created and then will continue to exist unless something annihilates it. And I don't see any argument for why one rather than the other. I don't mean to be ungenerous to Suarez. I mean, of course, the non-inertial view of motion would only support his case in the period. Nobody thought of inertial motion absent circular motion. Okay. With that, I'm gonna keep us on track and move us on a little bit here, and I'll talk about concurrence next. So, like most Christian medievalists, Suarez maintains that for creatures to bring about their customary effects within the order of nature, it is necessary for God not only to create and conserve creatures, but also to assist or concur in the productive activities. A wide variety of arguments are offered in support of positing this additional level of creaturely dependence. Suarez again offers an argument from analogy. It says, just as God can deprive a created entity of its essay merely by withholding its action, so too he can deprive a created entity of its natural action merely by withholding his concurrence. Therefore, just from the former power, one may evidently infer an immediate dependence in esse, so too from the latter power, one may infer an immediate dependence in the action itself. Again, we get an argument from analogy. I'm not sure I fully captured this with a quote. Again, we get an argument from analogy. I think it's drawing on a similar intuition that we saw in play in the conservation case. Something like the thought that dependent being, qua dependent being, must rely on its uncreated source at all times and in all respects. It seemed, okay. I didn't find this totally convincing in the conservation case for the reasons I just described about the inertial versus non-inertial. I think perhaps it's even a little less convincing in the concurrence case. It seems one thing to suggest that the existence of a substance requires conservation, and another thing to suggest that its actions require active existence. I'm not sure that you can get much support from analogy to move from the one to the other. That is, I'm not sure that you get from the conservation thought to the concurrence thought, even by analogy. I suspect, however, did you want to say?
So I'm questioning,
Yeah.
what does he mean by saying withholding his action? What kind of action?
Okay, I will come back to that. It's a good question. I'll come back to that. I suspect, however, that the arguments from natural reason aren't really in the driver's seat here anyway. I suspect that the most persuasive arguments for Christian medieval thinkers were rooted in considerations of piety. Suarez, for example, concludes his arguments in favor of concurrentism from natural reason with what he calls, quote, the best argument. And here it is. This manner of acting in and with all agents pertains to the breath of divine power, and on God's part it presupposes a perfection untainted by imperfection. Therefore, this general influence should not be denied to God. Here I think we begin to touch the question I raised in the beginning. Why did Christian medieval thinkers reject occasionalism? Perhaps the deepest reason, I think, is that they thought that it struck a middle position that they thought concurrentism struck a middle position that they thought promoted piety rather than either mere conservationism or occasionalism. So let me backtrack a little bit. So on the one side, mere conservationists held that having created and conserved creatures, complete with their own active and passive causal powers, those creatures required nothing further on God's part in order for them to bring about their customary effects within the order of nature. They held, for example, that if God creates and conserves a fire, complete with its causal powers, the fire requires no further assistance in order to, say, boil upon water. So this is to Suarez is mere conservationism. They've got creation, conservation. Just about everybody in our period, in this period that we're talking about, accepted those two doctrines. Suarez can think why Suarez is arguing for, or we're trying to figure out why Suarez thinks we need a third doctrine, concurrence. And concurrence is the view that even in the creaturely action, God's got to actively assist. God's got to help out. We saw one argument by analogy. I don't think that's what's really driving. I think it's really driving this view of piety. This view of piety is driving this additional commitment. So why is this a pious view? Suarez thinks, well, it does better than the mere conservationists. Why? Well, I think essentially the thought is it gets God more involved. And the more you can get God involved in the world, the less danger there is of you being an atheist, the more respect and admiration you have for God's involvement and God's operations, the more intimately related God is with creation. So that makes concurrence, for Suarez, attractive over mere conservationists. The other extreme will be familiar to a few of you, is occasionalism, right? As I understand occasionalism, among more sophisticated scholars, there's different versions of occasionalism, but as I understand occasionalism, held that God is the sole and complete efficient cause of creatures and their natures. Just as he's the sole creative cause, he's also the sole and complete efficient cause of effects produced within the order of nature. That is what I called earlier production. Okay. Most Christian medievalists saw an advantage in concurrentism over occasionalism because they thought that genuine causal contribution on the part of creatures was a necessary condition for freedom and responsibility. In a way, occasionalism is an attractive position for them, because they're of the mind that the more involved God is, the better. And occasionalism couldn't make God more involved. But they think that's a step too far, because they think if God's doing everything, then people aren't responsible. If wills aren't active causes, or even in some sense, then there's no freedom, there's no responsibility. So, concurrentism, they think, is a happy middle course. And I think that's the deep reason why there's so many concurrentists in this period in the West. And conversely, why there's so few occasionalists. I'm going to make just two quick notes on this. First note, Suarez is not being driven, if I've got this right, he's not being driven by the thought that creaturely causation is impossible or incoherent. If that, right, and I flag that because later people will suggest that creaturely causation is incoherent, it's impossible. If that's your view, if that were his view, then considerations of piety would be beside the point. Right? Because if it's just not possible for creatures to cause things, say because they can't produce a necessary connection, and a necessary connection is a necessary condition for a cause, then it doesn't matter what would be more pious or not, that's not on the table. So occasionalism might be the best possible option. I'm suggesting Suarez doesn't see creaturely causation as being impossible or incoherent, so then he's got a view of considerations about what most promotes piety, what's the best of many possible views. Second note, if the argument against occasionalism is really bound up with freedom and responsibility, that is, if they're rejecting occasionalism because they think that occasionalism will undermine creaturely freedom and therefore creaturely responsibility, if that's their view, it's not clear why we shouldn't be occasionalists about everything other than, say, willing or volition. Right? There's a possible view out there that says all creatures do is will, and then God picks it up from there. And we're responsible because we're just short of occasionalism because there are finite causes, and we're responsible for it, but God takes it over from there. I flagged that as a trailer for the talk on Sunday, I think. My talk on Sunday. That's going to come up, what's that? On Saturday. That's going to come up in the talk on Barclay. Some people have a reading of Barclay, where that's the sort of view he wants. And I'm suggesting that Suarez sort of loads that as a possible picture already. I know we should see that. Okay.
So let's be clear.
Yes.
In this period, I want to discuss this. Creation is something not just referring to initial creation, but covers even now. But there are different models of creation, right? Occasionalism, concretism, mere conservation, right?
All right. So this is good. Let's be clear. I think the way to think of this is as there being two causal orders. For some reason, I think of the one causal order as being vertical and the other one as being horizontal. So there's a doctrine of creation, and the doctrine of creation says there's an eternal being, and it brings into existence creatures. It brings them into existence ex nihilo. That's the order of creation. There's this other thing I call it production. Like when two bunnies give rise to a new bunny. Strictly speaking, that is not creation. That is in the other order of nature. That's within the order of nature. I call that production. Why is it creation? Because it starts with stuff that already exists. It starts in particular with form and matter. So it's like making a vase. It starts with matter and you bring form together and you get a vase. All of that is creaturely production. So the first doctrine is creation that brings into being. There's a second doctrine that says, in that order, in the order of creation, there's also there's a dependence that we'll call conservation. Conservation is in the same order as creation. At least, and again, although again there's an analog, just like there's a creaturely analog to creation that I call production, there's a creaturely analog to conservation, what I usually call preservation. And I think it's important to keep those two orders straight. And so our first two doctrines, strictly speaking, concern creation and conservation. And then our third doctrine was specifically about the order in nature. And the thought was that, for these guys, is that God's not only required to bring it into existence and to conserve it in existence, but when, say, the fire acts on the pot, God's got to intervene in this order as well, in the actual cause, in the order of nature. So when a created cause brings about a created effect, God's got to actively assist. God's got to concur.
Doesn't this boil down to be recreativity, recreation, taking into consideration that this guy was contemporary or just previous to Descartes, is it?
So
look at the time when he lived, this guy Suarez lived before Descartes. And Descartes talked about recreation and conservation.
Yeah. So I think Suarez does not think that. So Suarez does not see creation and conservation as undermining or replacing creaturely efficient causation. And I think Descartes, we have other Descartes scholars. I think Descartes' unclear about this. I think he starts thinking about time, and he hits on this sort of thought that, and he starts to have the thought that conservation isn't a continuous creation, it's a continuous recreation. And I think Malebranche is the one that really picks up with that thought and gives an argument. But of course, he wants to be an occasionalist. So he thinks he's got an argument for occasionalism based on the doctrine that I think he's a little crafty about this, because everybody accepts the doctrine that conservation is a continuous creation. And what Malebranche sort of attributes to things is, sort of slides in there, is that conservation is a continuous recreation. And that's Suarez doesn't think. And that's why it's important to him that he thinks there's merely a rational distinction between creation and conservation. There aren't a series of acts, a series of creations. There's a creation and a conservation. And he thinks that leaves open the possibility that the things that get created have their own active and passive causal powers, and that those bring about changes within the order of nature, provided God gives us concurrence, which is a third separate act from creation and conservation.
So there are two ways, either recreation or imminence. So if he doesn't believe in recreation as a means of conservation, then we have to take the other view, which is when he talked about the sun and the light. This is eminence. Similar to Al-Farad,
Emanations.
emanation.
Yeah.
So, Suarez, is the distinction between conservation and concurrence a real one?
That's a good question. I think it is. I'm hesitant without going back to the text, but I think it's not merely a rational distinction.
Right.
It's a further act. Yeah.
It's a more rational distinction.
Yeah.
Because presumably God is not concurring with any given cause at every time at which it exists. It's only like, let's say, the example you gave, you bring fire, you put fire to the pot and it heats it. Before you put it to the pot, before you brought it into contact, God isn't concurring in the effect of heating with the fire.
Yeah, although that's right, and I think the thought's right. Although there is no act of heating the fire, heating the water until they're near each other, so you could think there's no act to be conserved either. But I think the telltale sign is that he thinks that God, he certainly thinks that God can conserve the fire and save the water, and no heating occur by withholding his concurrence, not his conservation. And that suggests that there's a further thing.
Right, but it goes from not concurring to concurring.
Well, not in general. It's not like it's a little tricky, but it's not like he wasn't concurring when they're far apart. Like, you have the pot, you fill up the sink, before he puts on the fire. It's not like God's not concurring. There's nothing to concur with.
But
When you put it on the fire, now there's something to concur with, namely the causal powers, the active power of the fire and the passive power of the pot.
So what does God actually produce in this case? Well, how does the concurrence work? I mean, what does the fire do, and what does God?
Yeah. Okay. Good. So let me push on to the last section. Is that where I am? Yes. Last section. 3 challenges. Okay. So, having looked at Christian medieval views on creation, conservation, and concurrence, I thought we might close by considering three challenges. You guys are on to one more, right? And some responses to it. So the first challenge was to provide an account of the nature of the cooperative action performed by God as creatures and concurrently producing an effect. What's the nature of this action, this concurrent action? You can get a feel for why this is a problem if you suppose that God can. This came up. I just realized now indirectly in one of the questions I asked. You get a feel for why this is a problem. If you suppose that God concurs by giving a creature some additional powers or capacities to act. For example, God, as it were, supercharges the thing. That's how God concurs. Right? Whose talk was this? Was making it ready? Yeah, right. You could think that's the concurrence. Is you give it the extra buzz that gets it, then it's able to act. But that won't obviously distinguish the concurrence position from a mere conservationist. After all, the mere conservationist agrees that God must directly create and conserve all the causal powers of creatures. So why shouldn't we count the supercharging, the buzz, whatever it is, as just one more God-given power? So if the fire can't act without the supercharging, then why not think the supercharging is just one more power that God's got to give it? Suarez's solution to the challenge of providing an account of the nature of cooperative action performed by God and his creatures is to suggest that where God concurs with the creature in producing an effect, he acts immediately with the creature in order to bring about the effect in question. On this picture, God and the creature both act in producing a particular effect in such a way that the immediate and direct causal contribution of each is necessary and taken together sufficient for the production of the relevant effect. In case that isn't crystal clear, here's an anachronistic example that I like, I throw used to using. Consider the action of a working electric toaster. Plausibly, the causal influence of the electricity and of the toaster combine through a single immediate action in the production of a heating or a toasting. The causal contribution of each agent, the electricity and the toaster, is necessary to the action in question, namely the toasting. And together they're sufficient. Neither the contribution of electricity alone, nor the toaster alone, produces a heating or a toasting. It is only the two agents causally working together that the relevant action occurs. I think that's a model. I offer that as an anachronistic model of how you might think about the unified action. It's one thing to say it's unified, it's one thing to give the conditions for it, another way to have some sort of model of how you're supposed to think about it. I think that's one way to sort of think about it. I guess, question
much time do we have?
Half an hour.
Okay, well, so before I push on that, any thoughts about unified action? Is okay with that? Great. Searchable text of Suarez or toaster. All right, so let's talk about unified effect. The second and closely related challenge faced by concurrence is to explain how we are to think about the effects brought about concurrently by God and His creatures. Again, we can get a sense of the problem. Suppose that we thought that the cooperative action of God and a creature must result in a necessarily conjunctive effect. So, for example, we might suppose that where God and a strong man concur in lifting a 100-pound barbell, God directly causes the raising of, say, 50 pounds, while the strong man directly causes the raising of the other 50. That would be a conjunctive effect. Perhaps more plausibly, in Suarez's context, we might suppose that where God and a pair of rabbits concur to produce a bunny, God is the immediate cause of its matter, while the rabbits are the immediate cause of its form. In both cases, from a metaphysical point of view, the total effect is plausibly the straightforward conjunction of two partial effects. A conjunctive effect runs into difficulties. Most obviously, it looks like we have a case of occasionalist causation for one of the conjuncts, and a case of mere conservation causation for the other conjunct. God lifts 50 pounds himself on the occasion of the strong man lifting 50 pounds on his own. God causes the matter, and the bunny causes the form. Non-concurrent. Right? So if you've got, we're just trying to get a sense of the problem here, right? The problem with the effect is, if you think it's, how do two creatures bring about a single effect? You might think, well, the effect's a conjunctive effect. And so, God brings about one half, as it were, and we bring out the other half. But in that case, you're going to run into troubles, because it's going to start looking like it's collapsing away from concurrence. It's looking like, in particular, that you're getting a non-concurrence cause of one half, and an occasionalist cause of the other half. So Suarez's solution is to suggest that just as the action is unified and single, so too the effect produced is unified and whole. Unified or whole. Returning to our toaster example. The unified effect model suggests that we should think of the electricity and the toaster as cooperating in the production of a whole or entire toasting. As opposed, for example, to thinking of the electricity as producing half the toasting, and the toaster is producing the other half the toasting. So that's, again, an offered example for how we might think about the problem of the action and the problem of the effect. All right, everybody doing all right?
Well, I think the weightlifting example is just as good. Because if you and I pick up 100 pounds, together, you can't specify which 50 I picked up and which 50 you picked up.
Right.
It's not like I pick up a certain 50 and you do. So maybe that would be a decent.
Right. There's a way of, I say, if you think of it as a conjunctive effect, that is, if you think of it as like, that was the suggestion. Like, if you think of it as, well, how does this work? The effect is necessarily a conjunctive effect. So it's like the 100-pound thing consists of two 50-pound pieces, and we each pick up one 50-pound piece. Then you're going to be in trouble.
No, it's a one.
You're thinking it's one thing, and then we're heading in the right direction. I think that's right. So I'm not suggesting that you couldn't make a weight case that would work. You're saying there's a way of making a weight case where it won't work. And there's questions about, I think Ferdoso gives an example. Is this, the video's been running, I'm not sure I remember this correctly. I thought you had an example of picking up the back end of a car. There's two people picking up the back end of a car. Well, there's a way of thinking about it where we do it together. I think the toasting is unfortunately better, or makes more sense to me. All right, Mark is not gone yet. So
these are all these metaphorical examples. I'm wondering, does Suarez characterize God's positive contribution in any terms, or is it just really that God just doesn't say nay? How does he concur exactly? What is he doing?
Well, I think he's acting, he acts through a unified action to produce a unified effect. And you might think, in some ways, what we're asking for is more than I think Suarez is giving us. Because we want some sort of intuitive law.
I have a feeling if you cash that out, you're going to end up with occasionalism, but it's just
Yeah, wow.
That's my worry. I mean, I don't understand how. I still don't get a positive characterization of God's oomph, what he's delivering here.
Yeah, I can give you sort of the formal ways. It's a necessary condition, jointly sufficient. That doesn't give you sort of a feel for what's going on. It gives you the conditions. I will say, sort of, Suarez is happy, as you've seen, to argue by an element. And so I think, in some ways, yeah, that's fine. And can I have a toaster? Yeah. Although I guess not if I recently do that. Yes?
I'm just wondering if, with respect to the unified effect, if there's sort of, if you can't trace back in the effect something to God, something feature, how isn't that, how doesn't that amount to causally over-determining the effect?
Right, so good. This is slimmed down, right? They also he doesn't want causal overdetermination. Why is that? Because causal overdetermination wouldn't be a case of what he thinks was concurrence at all. Right? Because then it'd be redundant. I would still be bringing things about. It would just be to happen in the case that God's like backing up just in case. God's the second rock going towards the window or something. Right? So he doesn't want that at all. And I think like the toasting case is not a case of causal overdetermination. The electricity by itself doesn't cause toasting. And the toaster by itself doesn't cause toasting. So it's not the case that the toasting is overdetermined. It's sort of jointly determined. And that's the sort of thing he wants.
Yeah, but then the question is, can God alone cause the toasting?
Yes, so God can cause the toasting alone, but not in the manner in which he brings it about when he's concurring.
Okay, but why do we need the other partition of the creation?
It's not like there's anything that you do that God can't do by himself. So in that sense of need, you don't need a secondary cause. So the reasons for the secondary causes are not because God needs your help. The reasons for the secondary causes are, reasons why God creates whatever story you have. So that's all correct. And Suarez thinks in this action, the action, so if I lift the bottle, in that action, God's concurrence is not sufficient to raise the bottle. Because God, as it were, is choosing to concur with my action. But that doesn't mean that God couldn't just cause the bottle to go up. Or to make it go up or whatever. All those are possible.
It seems that when speaking about unified action, the most natural way to think of it, in case there are several actors, as in this case, would be that they have the same intention. Right? If you and I were to lift a very big stone, and we both try to lift the stone. But that's not the case when God helps me, say, drink water, because my intention is to drink the water, God's intention is to help me to drink the water. God doesn't want me to drink the water. And I suppose I find it puzzling. Maybe you could say, maybe you could still speak about action and say that it's a joint action, somehow in a similar sense that groups might act. That you could have, 3 persons forming a group and deciding what to do by both, and 2 of them say yes, and 1 of them say no, and you still say that the group has to do it, although the intentions don't.
So, can you let me know where let's say 10 and stuff? Okay, so right now we have 20.
Okay, just give me a heads up. I'll so, okay, so good. Those are all sort of fun, interesting questions. I think as part, I don't know your own background, so I feel like there's a view of this might we recast in terms of activity. So there's a way of thinking about action where it's very bound up with intentionality, and in which if you were looking at that framework, you might think this is a weird sort of action because if the intentions aren't lining up, then they can't be the same action. I don't think he's got anything invested in this being an action in that loaded sort of sense. What he wants is an activity. And there you might think
efficacy is sort of quite clear about the nature of the act itself.
Yeah. And so, like, you know,
how effective action was, not how action is.
Yeah, if there's, you know, two oxen going in opposite directions, and one wants to go that way and one wants to go this way, they're both pulling the plow. I think in our sense, we've got one action. You know, I'm assuming they're all hooked together, right? Even though there's in some sense different intentions. That doesn't matter in this sort of case, although I understand this other sort of case you might think. And then the social case is sort of interesting way to go. But that'll be a different sense of concurrence and different.
Doesn't the question what exactly God produces and what, let's say, the creature, the agent produces, depend on what the nature of the effect is? And again, I'm thinking of in Avicenna terms.
Yeah, right.
So, for instance, he gave several examples. The lifting of a bottle, that's just an accident. The act is an accident, so it's not the change that occurs is an accidental change. Whereas, again, given another example that you mentioned, when two parents produce a child, there's the creation of a new form here, a new thing. And that's a very different sort of effect. And it's, again, for a theologian, it would be problematic to say that the parents produce the child in the same way that I did a bottle of water. So, and it's a very different effect because there's a substance that comes into being. There's creation. So Avicenna would say, again, using the terminology used in parents, I mean, he would say that the parents produce the readiness in the material, in the matter, potentiality, in other words. They can produce, natural causes can produce motion in matter, this motion can produce potentiality in matter, and the form comes from above. In this case, from God, whereas for Avicenna, it's from another lesson.
Yeah. Great. So I want to bracket let's bracket rational being, the creation of rational beings, because there's going to be soul words about where the soul's coming from. If we bracket that, and I use bunnies, we bracket that. I think Suarez actually thinks that he agrees that these are different in the sense that one's an accidental change and one's a substantial change. But I don't think he thinks they're all that different. Because I think he thinks in the cases of an accidental change, what's being brought about is a accidental problem. What's being brought about in a substantial case is an accidental form and a substantial form. So they're different in the kinds of forms that are being brought about. But I think he thinks of them both as being acts of what I call production rather than creation. Because he thinks the form and the matter are both already present in both cases. At least potentially, and it's being reduced from actuality to potentiality. And so he thinks both cases, he thinks, as far as these doctrines are concerned, they're I'm hesitating, but essentially on a par. It's just that we distinguish between the substantial changes and the accidental changes. And that might be different from Avicenna. And in the rational case is something to keep an eye on, because that can be trickier, because he might think that the soul's got to be, shot in, has to be created, and then time is looking.
I just want to follow up Vila's point, which I think raises huge problems, and maybe all we can do now is you can tell us whether Suarez even deals with these problems. How do we describe, let's say I pick up 100 pounds.
Yeah.
Do we now say I picked up the 100 pounds? Do we say God and I together pick them up, which is a different action, a cooperative action.
Yeah.
Do we say God picked up 50 pounds? Do we say God enabled me to pick up 50 pounds, but he didn't do any lifting?
And I suspect, I mean, you haven't exactly said it, but I suspect, and why should we care? I mean, what should we say? We could say, with divine concurrence, I pick up the 100 pounds. But I suspect part of what's driving the question is, maybe I'll get this last little bit, the last problem, which you can correct me if you're not heading in this direction. That's the case. That you are. It's responsibility. You might think those descriptions alter how we think about the responsibility for not picking up 100 pounds.
No, I'm really thinking of a metaphysical question.
Then
how deeply do we have to re-describe human action?
Yeah.
And how deeply do we have to re-describe divine action? Does God really pick up weights? Does God really?
Well, by the first two, God, we do all those things through a unified act. Yeah. So God concurs with our, let's boil a lot with our, when we build a ship. God concurs in that causal activity.
But he does more than that. I talk to my brother and say, do I have enough money to have a new child? Or do I need to make more money? My brother concurs.
Oh, no, it's not that kind of concur.
No, but then God gets pretty invasive.
Oh, yeah. So, and this actually goes back to our earlier question. The way they think about it is that the more invasive, the better. So they agree with the sentiment, right? Occasionalism is rejected not because it makes God too involved, right? So I think, later on, interestingly, some people will have the intuition that God shouldn't be a busybody. God shouldn't be so involved in the world as that beneath this period, they don't have that intuition at all. They want God as involved as possible, and the only reason not to go towards occasionalism is because you still want responsibility. And they think if God isn't in your business everywhere, then the more in your business, the better, as long as he's not doing the business for you. And so he's just concurrent. And they think if God removes this concurrence, you can still do everything that you do, and you won't bring about your effects. And they think that happens in what they call contradictory miracles. Okay, last little piece, responsibility.
I wonder whether Suarez gets into those issues in that chapter of how we describe.
Yeah, worth looking at. Yeah. Okay. I don't think he's just worried about the description. I think, in a sense, we've gotten the metaphysics of it. So if the description is really about worrying about the metaphysics, I think he thinks, I've told you what the metaphysics is like. I thought that maybe this other question is maybe about responsibility. And so I think the third challenge faced by concurrence is to offer account as to why, if God concurs in the production of every creaturely effect, only creatures are held responsible for sinful activities within the order of nature. Again, it's easy to get a sense of the word. If the action of robbing the bank is a concurrent action, why are God and I equally responsible for it? Right? If we do this together, through a single unified effect, with a single unified outcome, why am I the one that gets in trouble for it? If I'm a bank robber, why isn't God a bank robber? Medievals in general answered that even where God and creatures concur in producing an effect, certain aspects of that effect may properly be attributed to the creature rather than God. So, for example, Molina suggests that when God and a fire concur in producing a heating, the fact that a heating is produced, as opposed to, say, a cooling, is to be traced back to the fire and its causal powers. For in this case, a heating is produced rather than a cooling because God's concurrence is paired up with causal powers of fire rather than with causal powers of water. Drawing on our earlier analogy, we might similarly say that the fact that a toasting occurs, as opposed to, say, a blending or a beating, is to be traced back to the toaster and its causal powers. Since in this case, a toasting is produced rather than a blending or a beating, because the electricity is paired up or concurs with a toaster rather than with a blender or a beater. And in some ways, I think it's sort of, you can get the sense of that. The original problem seems to be sort of, wow, that seems like a real problem. But I think they've got a pretty plausible story that even if it's unified action, you can see why the action, the nature of the action might be traced back to one of the two concurring agents, nonetheless. So likewise, Suarez suggests that when God and a free agent concur in producing a sinful action, the fact that a sinful action is produced, as opposed to a virtuous one, is to be traced back to the finite agent and its will. For in this case, a sinful action is produced rather than a virtuous one, because God's concurrence is paired up with a sinful will rather than with a virtuous will. In this way, a finite agent may be held to be responsible for a sinful action, even when that sinful action presupposes God's active assistance within the ordered nature. And you can also say God doesn't intend the sinful action, in spite of the fact that God concurs with that sinful action. Mark is not going to be happy with this.
Is the difference between concurring and permitting just a rational distinction? This goes back to what I worried about earlier.
No, Mark, it's a metaphysical distinction, right? There's, it's not just permission. Here's a different view. Here's a different possible view of concurrence. Concurrence means that God concurs by sitting back. And so, if I want to, I don't know, if I want to throw the ball, God concurs by not preventing it. That's not the picture in mind. It's more like God's like, helping me throw the ball. And you might, well, why that? And one reason, at least, why not that, is that they thought this is a real case for them. So here, they think there are cases of contradictory variables. Now, what does that mean? So the classic case is the children not being burned in the fire. And here's one possible way it could go. The kids are in the fire. Never walking east, is that correct pronunciation? Right. The kids are in the fire.
Yes.
Never. Good. I was just saying that. All right. So God shields them from the fire, and then they don't get burned. They think that's a bad picture of what's going on because there's something unseemly about God opposing the causal powers that He creates. It's like God having to go to battle with His own causal powers and then being in a sort of contest. That God, of course, wins, but nonetheless, it's sort of beneath Him to be doing this. So they think a better, and that's the model of concurrence you were suggesting. So they think it's a better model, that God's always helping. And nothing brings about its effects without God's help. So in that case, what happens is God withholds His concurrence. That is, He doesn't help. And without God's help, the fire doesn't do anything.
I think I got it. Thanks.
Yeah. New question.
Well, I have a question. I'll take this question as a humble question because I'm still trying to learn what's going on in this area. So it seems to me that in order to save the idea of responsibility and freedom, he needs to account for another problem. And this problem seems to be something about the extent of God's knowledge. So if we assume that God is a being whose knowledge is limitless, then one can form an example in which one can show that with this assumption, we cannot save the idea of responsibility and freedom. So suppose that tomorrow I will form an intention to do something, and suppose also that God has limitless knowledge, which means that He knows now that I will form the intention tomorrow. And if we accept that He knows that fact will take place in the actual world. Which means that I am determined to perform that action tomorrow. And which also means that I'm not free at all. And I cannot be counted as responsible for my action. So does He have any solution to this problem, or He doesn't address it?
It's a good problem. It's a classic problem. It's a good question. It's one that Suarez has got to deal with. He doesn't fit under this category. So you won't find this in DM 20 to 2022. So he thinks the divine foreknowledge is being a distinct problem. And then there are various possible solutions to that.
Do you think that it's a problem for him because he wants to preserve the idea of responsibility and freedom?
I think it's a problem for everybody in tradition. Because they all want to maintain divine foreknowledge, they all want to maintain priestly responsibility. So it's a problem for everybody.
Do you think that there's a possible way to preserve the two together?
I think there are various possible strategies. So one, for example, Molina's suggestion is that, I don't want to get into this, right? They're all hard. But I mean, one thought is, what God knows is that you're going to freely do this tomorrow. And so, when you're put in that position, what God knows is, so me, for example, later on I'll go to dinner and, I will eat dessert because that's what I do when I go to dinner. Right? But I'm still do that freely. And if you know me well, you'll probably know I'll eat dessert. If you were God, you'd be absolutely certain that I'll eat dessert. But the part of the thought is, but that doesn't mean that God's causing me or forcing me to eat dessert. But there's problems with that too, and there's other possible solutions and stuff. But it's not a particular problem coming out of concurrence. Everybody's going to have this problem. Last question.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Talk.
About your answer about the responsibility. It's not God. God's not doing anything wrong. It's my wicked volitions which are responsible. But my volitions are my actions. In fact, let's take some not all actions are such that I intend something and then bring about an intent. It seems simply reasonable to describe having volitions as kinds of actions, at least from a metaphysical point of view. They're actions of mind. So let's take some very big volition, like having a pornographic thought or something like that, which would be something that Suarez would certainly consider to be vice. That's something that I do. And to do something, I suppose I need God again. I mean, God helps me to bring about my dirty thoughts about.
Right, but those dirty thoughts come about. The responsibility for those dirty thoughts are to be traced back to you rather than God. So the same thing's going to be true even of volitions.
Yeah, well, I think that's the message about. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, quite followed. You didn't twist my intuitions. I just didn't quite get what you were saying. Maybe another way of saying, how's your view different from the occasionalist view, which takes the volitions to be the primary bearers of responsibility, which is something that Malebranche in his big moments seems to propose.
So good question. So let's be clear about this. I don't think. So here's the view, right? Volitions are that's what you're really responsible for. You're non-consequentialist. That seems like in general, like for these people. I don't think that lines up with occasionalism or concurrentism. The question is, it just focuses, as it were, right? You might think, drinking a cup of coffee is the action. You might think, and I'm responsible for that. You might think, it's really just my intention to drink a cup of coffee. But these two, as you shrink, the occasionalism and concurrentist will still be different. The occasionalist, at least if the occasionalist is strict, the occasionalist will say, even my volition is something that I don't actively causally bring about.
And that's something that Malebranche doesn't always say.
Malebranche, I think, is a little cagey on that. And that, I think that's actually a problem for Malebranche. I think I see why he's cagey about it, but then there's sort of questions about, well, then, if you get that the pressure on occasionalism. I mean, as the concurrentists already know. But then if you say, there's some secondary causes, they're just volitions, well then I think you're no longer an occasionalist. And if you think secondary causation is impossible, then you ought to explain why it's not impossible in the volitional case. But that's just to say you're going to have a concurrent volition.
Thank you very much, Jeff.